Okay, look. This sex thing, not very hard. PP goes in, PP goes out. Repeat steps 1 and 2 for like a good solid 2 to 3 minutes. Good for me, not for thee. And BAM! You're in there. Or at least you were? Hey, look, still beat though. So normally I like to make an outline for my videos just so I can provide them with some sort of structure and really ask myself the question, why am I making this video and why should we care? Which in this case, who really cares? I mean, maybe, kind of, possibly, sort of, we shouldn't. I mean, I'm just saying random words, really, and what are words except just random vibrations of sound passing through the air? No, but seriously, I've been reading up on a few posts in recent months about just how exactly we view and confront the act of sex, and how exactly it can be shaped by standards placed in our heteronormative society. I've come to realize the sort of privilege that comes with being a heterosexual man, not only when it comes to depictions of sexual acts online, but even in our society, where it seems like a lot is tailored for us by us. I mean, for example, concepts like the male gaze exist for a reason, and I think it really speaks to the general expected representation of interest from the view of straight men in our media. The way that our books, video games, TV shows, movies, and more depict both men and women in the sense of their appearances and personalities are often from the lens of other straight men, kind of providing what they may like the idea of a man or woman to be or look like, rather than providing a more holistic or realistic perspective. So basically, straight men making what straight men want, all while ignoring the views of others regardless of their gender or sexuality. And this also can extend to our views of sex. At some point in life, it felt like the multi-million-dollar question would be to actually define just what exactly sex is. I can now define it for myself, and when I looked online, most other online dictionaries agreed. Merriam-Webster states, heterosexual intercourse involving penetration of the vagina by the penis, and intercourse, such as anal or oral intercourse, that does not involve penetration of the vagina by the penis. Oxford Dictionary states, the physical activity of sex. This term is usually used to refer to sex in which a man puts his penis inside a woman's vagina. From dictionary.com, a sex act that involves penetration of one person's vagina, anus, or mouth by another person for the sexual gratification of one or both parties. Now, these are some pretty encompassing definitions, but understanding that, well, other people who aren't straight also have sex, I noticed myself starting to question certain concepts like virginity. If you're coming from a more religious background, people seem to often tell you that once you've gone through the act stated earlier, you've lost it. But to take that logic based on some of the definitions stated earlier, or other definitions that people may have for themselves, that almost reads to me that this only would be valid for heterosexual people. So would things like using fingers be a sort of loophole around that all? When I was younger, this started to make a bit less and less sense to me, especially when I started to consider like all the different double standards that society has in place for both boys and girls on this topic. But in the end, maybe I and other online sources don't have to be what defines what sex means for you. I also feel like the concept of virginity also plays a role in just how we manufacture this sort of artificial social norm and pervasive idea of just how exactly it should be viewed when referring to both boys and girls. I remember growing up with this narrative tossed around that girls should be the one to stay pure and not be sleeping around with a bunch of boys, lest they be called some less than ideal terms. And on the other hand, it was almost like this sort of rite of passage or a contest to be the boy in his friend group who lost his virginity early and tried sleeping around with as many girls as possible, even regardless of who the girl was or how old or how inappropriate that relationship might have actually been. And so having a high body count as a boy meant you were a player, whereas for girls, you were shamed. When it comes to the boys, at the extreme end of this concept lies the space where some people have even verbally or socially rewarded young and underage boys if they've been groomed by full-grown adults. I'd argue that this continues well even into adulthood, where some people, I guess sometimes more so other men, may still try to link their sexual experiences and encounters to their self-worth or status, and that in itself could have to do more so with living in a patriarchal society. Though I'm not so certain how useful my own anecdotal evidence might be to this point, but I have started to assume that, at least when it comes to young boys, that this all does start leading to inappropriate acts that some people in our society would start to deem as acceptable. Another rather enticing point about this topic of reinventing how we think about sexual intimacy was brought to my attention when viewing more discussions online. Often when thinking or talking with others about sex, there's common patterns that may come up about what it entails or how it seems like it should be. For some of us, there's sort of a timeline of events that sits in our minds defining when sex begins and when it ends. In the world of het sex, sometimes the primary focus is only getting the guy aroused, but not tailoring as much of an experience or effort to a woman, sticking to just straight penetration for a few minutes, and then when one person comes, often the man, that's it. That's the plot, that's the performance. Whereas sex could be a lot more than just that. Including foreplay in sex, or even thinking of foreplay as a part of the entire process of sex at all, adding in more teasing throughout the day to create that buildup of tension and mystery, getting to explore your partner's body during the act, and not even thinking of the act of orgasming as the final act to end sex, could all contribute to making this reshaping of our sexual intimacies. When I noticed more write-ups about these things online, it seemed more like these views or acts were being reported from more gay or bisexual couples rather than straight ones. But that isn't to get up in your face and say, hey there, heterosexual person there, aka the problem. Though, even if this original aforementioned timeline of events is something that two people in a consenting sexual relationship abide by and it worked for them, and who am I to exactly say what's right or wrong? So there's a lot of moving parts to all of this and really trying to redefine what sex could look like for some of us. For some people, their perceptions might be both shaped and reinforced by any sort of online media that they may consume, more specifically porn. Now, to some, it's a problem, but to others, you just had to find ways to decompress. Softcore content and erotica may also have their place in this conversation, also potentially shaping our outlooks on what a sexual encounter can or should be. But I've been especially more intrigued at looking at and thinking about just how exactly more hardcore mainstream content skews our perceptions, especially since it appears to be the one most commonly consumed or discussed when it comes to online sexual media. The stage is rife with producers, directors, and websites that may tailor to the male gaze and even provide the most taboo topics as something to be consumed for pleasure. It sometimes can also give us a very unrealistic look or standard for how sex is supposed to be like due to this. The sounds, the movements, the positions, and more can kind of give a one-sided view, almost giving off a realities versus expectations type of situation. There's also these notions I'd read online where consistently consuming porn could create effects on reshaping what our brains find as pleasurable in a sexual encounter, and also make the gaps towards reaching that euphoric feeling even larger, eventually causing consumers to seek out more extreme forms of porn. At times, it did make me question if there were other standards or normal ways to have sex without having that input of porn in your mind, or if there's healthy ways to consume porn online and how much is too much, but there may be different individual answers for this. I don't know. I also kind of feel like the conversations that we're starting to have about sex, sexuality, and consent, and what really constitute as that, can sometimes make people feel rather uneasy or irritated. And these conversations are pretty unique depending on the audience. Because when you have the consent conversation with men about how when you're in the heat of the moment and an enthusiastic yes is not the same as an anxious or seemingly forced yes, or when you have a conversation with married couples about how your marriage doesn't give you agency to have sex with your spouse whenever you want to, especially if they're not in the mood or don't feel comfortable at the moment, there can be some pushback. Of course, our bodily autonomy doesn't just go straight out the window once we're in the constraints of a relationship, and along with that, it's always important to consider if someone is comfortable with continuing any sort of interaction during any sexual encounters. Even having the conversation about preferences and challenging possible biases can be an issue. Because we're always told that a preference is a preference is a preference, and that dating along with sex are both inherently discriminatory. But just as much as that might be true, is it not possible that there could possibly be more than meets the eye in this case? So these are just some of the conversations that I'm starting to notice, and it's been pretty intriguing to see how it's all been playing out so far. At times, these can turn into the uncomfortable conversations that we have because of the fact that it involves unlearning certain traits that we've been taught since we were younger. But I think that it makes it just as important to talk about them now in order to build up for a better future. So yeah, I don't really have much else to talk about on this topic at the moment. But in any case, I really hope that you all enjoyed this video, and I will see you all next time. From dictionary.com,